We shall pay any price, bear any burden to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
When John F. Kennedy assumed the office of president in 1961, he inherited the Cold War objectives of containing the Soviet Union and preventing the spread of communism in any form. He also inherited a tricky situation in Cuba, where Fidel Castro had consolidated his power and begun to forge strong ties with the Soviets. The situation dramatically escalated in October 1962, when the CIA showed Kennedy spy photographs that revealed missile launching sites under construction in Cuba. Told that nuclear warheads were already aboard Soviet ships headed for Cuba, Kennedy and his advisors, including Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, considered their options.
The next 24 hours, what is it we need to do? First, we need to do two things. First, we need to develop a specific strike plan. Second thing we have to do is to consider the consequences. I don't know quite what kind of a world we live in after we've struck Cuba.
Facing the prospect of all-out nuclear confrontation with the Soviets, the Kennedy team bought time.
To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
Kennedy's address threw the world into a state of fear, and people worried openly about nuclear Armageddon. Meanwhile, Kennedy still grappled with the urgent question. Negotiations with Soviet Premier Khrushchev were alternately frustrating and confusing, and Kennedy's military advisors urged an immediate airstrike.
We're not going to get these weapons out of Cuba properly anyway, by negotiation.
But Llewellyn Thompson, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, knew Khrushchev well from his many years in Moscow.
Hey, I don't agree with business. I think there's no chance. Get that down. The important thing for Khrushchev seems to me is to be able to say, I say to Cuba, I talk to the nation.
On Thompson's advice, Kennedy continued to negotiate. If Khrushchev would remove the missiles, the U.S. would not invade Cuba. Privately, the U.S. also agreed to remove its own nuclear missiles from Russia's close neighbor, Turkey. On Sunday, October 28th, Khrushchev announced on Radio Moscow the dismantling of the Cuban missiles.
The Soviet missile bases in Cuba are being dismantled. Their missiles and related equipment are being crated, and the fixed installations at these sites are being destroyed. And it is our firm hope and purpose that this progress shall go forward.
This is a special report from CBS News.
At its beginning, this day looked as though it might be one of armed conflict.
I think there are three lessons that derive from the Cuban Missile Crisis. First of all, a nuclear war, a major nuclear war that destroys a large portion of human civilization is possible. It came very, very close to happening. The second thing is that you can have this nuclear war even if nobody wants it. It doesn't require a crazy person. It doesn't require accidents or misfirings or anything like that. It just requires not understanding the motives of your adversary. Third, the lesson that comes to mind is that nuclear weapons have to be abolished. I don't know anybody who's really looked at the crisis who doesn't walk away from it thinking we've got to get rid of these things.
The resolution of the missile crisis had a strong influence on the team of presidential advisors who promoted America's growing involvement in Vietnam.
After all, they had faced down the Soviet Union and had done it without provoking war. I think they sort of believed that their success provided a sort of model for crisis management, as they called it, that would get them successfully through a crisis with a much smaller and presumably much weaker nation.
One thing the missile crisis did was to focus a lot of people at the sub-presidential level, even to the point of being a little bit paranoid or hyper-vigilant and looking for countries that we would, quote-unquote, lose to communism.
The empires that the Europeans had ruled over in various parts of the world come to pieces after World War II. Now, in Vietnam, the nationalist group that is demanding independence from France, that group happens to be communist. So the United States perceives what's happening as part of the larger conflict with the Soviet Union. In early 1950, we make our first commitment to assist the French militarily in fighting the war against Vietnam.
Ultimately, the French fail, and an agreement is reached at Geneva in Switzerland. Those Vietnamese who had fought with the French would move south of the 17th parallel. In 2 years' time, there would be general elections, free elections, to determine the shape of the country as a whole and who would lead it.
North Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh, a popular nationalist who had led the fight for freedom from the French since the end of World War II.
The general assumption is that if those elections had been held in 1956, Ho's group in the North would win the elections and therefore take over the whole country. For the United States, it's more than a moral dilemma. Free elections are what we advocate. They're part of our democratic principles.
Faced with certain defeat, President Eisenhower decided to back South Vietnam's refusal to hold the scheduled election.
It's a signal to North Vietnam, it's a signal to the Viet Minh who are remaining in the South that the elections are not going to take place and that therefore some other means is going to have to be found to unify the country. Hugely important, because what it means is that there's going to be another war.
In 1961, President Kennedy decided to increase pressure on Vietnam by providing money and military aid to the troubled country.
North Vietnam, by this time, is beginning to send men and supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail to support the insurgency in South Vietnam. Kennedy is not eager at this point to send U.S. troops, but he does dramatically increase the number of U.S. advisors. By the time Johnson takes office in November of '63, the means that Kennedy had created, sending in more advisors, more aid, it's clear that this isn't working. South Vietnam, once again, in early '64, is on the verge of collapse.
In June, President Johnson named General William C. Westmoreland as commander of forces in Vietnam. Westmoreland immediately asked for more men. In August, reports came in that North Vietnamese gunboats had fired on 2 U.S. ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Although the accuracy of these reports was in question, the president used them to demand authority from Congress to retaliate with armed force.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage.
It's very handy to Johnson in 2 ways. One, in the election, because he's getting really attacked by Barry Goldwater for the right for not being tough enough. So here is a tailor-made opportunity to show he's tough. It's also very useful to the extent that he has a perfect basis to get congressional authorization. I mean, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution basically says he can do pretty much anything he wants to repel the exact words armed aggression from North Vietnam.
Johnson's decisive response helped him win the 1964 election, but Saigon's prospects continued to decline. A consensus formed among Johnson's advisors that the U.S. should initiate air warfare against North Vietnam. In early February 1965, the administration began rolling thunder. Meanwhile, the Joint Chiefs of Staff endorsed Westmoreland's request for 150,000 U.S. troops to take the ground offensive in the South.
If you're not going to bomb North Vietnam off the map, which now could yield 2 nuclear responses, not just the Soviet Union, but China too, what's left to do? but to believe in your own sense that American troops can do what relatively poorly trained, ill-motivated South Vietnamese troops can't do. And that's the beginning. And each time you put a unit down, you got to put another and another. It's like a gambler with a losing hand.
You can hear him say over and over again, I don't like this. I have no enthusiasm for this war. I don't want to send our boys out there to fight. But then always in the back of his mind is this lurking fear of failure and defeat.
Despite this major escalation of U.S. forces, there was little hope for a military victory. In 1967, Johnson sent a message to Ho Chi Minh seeking to open negotiations. The reply was harsh.
The Vietnamese people will never submit to force. They will never accept talks under threat of bombs. Our cause is absolutely just.
Ultimately, the North Vietnamese were willing to incur much greater costs than we assumed. They were willing to do a lot more than ultimately it turned out we were willing to do. And so it's a fateful miscalculation.
Sniper fire is still coming from some buildings around the American officers' quarters, just across the street from the Joint Chiefs of Command.
This is the main Vietnamese language radio station in Saigon.
Every night we'd sit there in front of the TV and we'd watch the Vietnam War right there, brought into our living room, and we'd debate it and discuss it. All those powerful images that I still see them. I mean, think about it a lot.
You lost any friends?
Quite a few. We lost one the other day. The whole thing stinks, really.
With Vietnam, you saw it. You sat there having dinner, and there were these guys being chopped up. And that wasn't a good deal.
Into your living room, at your dining room table, looking at the counts, looking at the people. It brought it to a very human level. And I think that that's why it was so powerful, and that the anti-war movement grew so strong.
My son Mark was an anti-war protester. He was going through high school at the time.
I was preparing to become a conscientious objector. I had some very strong feelings about not going to Vietnam, but I also had some very strong feelings about being an American. I felt it was extremely important then that I take a stand and say, I do not believe in this war.
In April 1965, a Washington, D.C. protest drew 20,000 people. 2 years later, 70,000 protesters marched on the Pentagon as many young men burned their draft cards. The growing strength of the movement increasingly influenced public opinion, both against the war and against the protesters.
That's the intriguing paradox of the anti-war movement. A lot of Americans who didn't like the war, who thought it was a mistake, also felt that part of the problem was these crazy kids who were screaming about how evil America was. They wanted to go back to a time when America seemed to be doing the right thing in the world.
I think that Lyndon Johnson was stunned by the reaction on college campuses and city streets of a new left, of a youthful, radical protest movement. He had thought that young, reform-oriented people were going to be his greatest allies. So I think that he understood that the war undercut his plans for a war on poverty and the Great Society. He once said, near the end of his life, that bitch of a war, Vietnam, killed the lady I really love, the Great Society.
In the face of growing criticism, the Johnson administration launched a PR campaign that cast a false optimism on American progress in the war. But in the early morning of January 30th, 1968, Viet Cong forces launched a surprise assault on American and South Vietnamese forces. The Tet Offensive, named for the Vietnamese New Year, marked a significant turning point in the war.
There is a huge negative impact when the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese are able to mount, one, the biggest offensive they've mounted in the entire war, and two, to do a lot of this in the urban areas where they had had very little influence before and where America and South Vietnam had reigned supreme up to this time.
Everybody looks at everybody else and says, but I thought we were winning. And we're clearly not. And the feeling of deception, of being lied to, is overwhelming. Walter Cronkite, who was the dean of TV news anchors, essentially resigned from the Vietnam War at that point.
To say that we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, the optimists who have been wrong in the past. To suggest we are on the edge of defeat is to yield to unreasonable pessimism. To say that we are mired in stalemate seems the only realistic, if unsatisfactory, conclusion. It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out then will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could.
With American sons in the field far away, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes.
Certainly throughout his presidency, Johnson had always assumed and planned to run for re-election in 1968, but mainly because of opposition to his conduct of the war in Vietnam, he was not going to have the support of a large portion of his own party. And so, in March of 1968, he made a stunning announcement that opened the field.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Greatest honor history can bestow is the title of peacemaker.
Richard Nixon promised to achieve peace with honor in Vietnam, but once in office, he and his principal foreign policy advisor, Henry Kissinger, rejected a swift U.S. withdrawal.
Nixon and Kissinger had grand ambitions for U.S. foreign policy in a very different world. They were seeking to sort of de-escalate or defuse the Cold War from the intensity of the late 50s and the early 60s. And they felt very strongly that if they simply pulled out of Vietnam, they would not have the credibility, the presence to be able to deal effectively with the Soviet Union and China. Nixon realizes that he needs to get the war over with. First, he does what he thinks Eisenhower did in Korea to end the war, and that is to send threats that if they don't settle reasonably soon, we will use unlimited force against them, presumably even nuclear weapons. They called his bluff. This throws him back on what comes to be called a policy of Vietnamization. Of course, that's the reason we had gone in big in the first place was because South Vietnam couldn't handle it. And in point of fact, of course, it hadn't changed. Vietnamization did not work and could not work without a continued large-scale American presence.
In 1970, faced with mounting public dissatisfaction and diplomatic frustration, Nixon sent U.S. units into Cambodia.
If, when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation, the United States of America, acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten free nations and free institutions throughout the world.
This move sparked a firestorm of protests by the anti-war movement. One demonstration at Kent State in Ohio led to a tragic ending. As opposition to the war grew and the beginnings of U.S. withdrawal became more obvious, the morale and discipline of U.S. troops declined.
I can remember laying in the jungle and having the earth shake beneath me because of the saturation bombing.
I was scared. You always think you're gonna get shot down or shot at or captured.
We didn't know nothing about Vietnam. Here we are talking about fighting on ground. He's coming up out of the ground and coming out of the trees.
Napalm injuries, I remember those, how bad they smelled. Taking care of people whose village was accidentally napalmed, how often that must have happened.
Every day they would say, kill. You jump up out of bed, kill. You go to eat, kill. And when I went to the Nam, that's all I had in me, kill.
I really started to question, what the hell are we doing here? We're not helping these people. All we're doing is just making a bad situation worse.
All I knew was that I was not going to die over here.
I went out in a helicopter to this base of a platoon. It just looked like the moon. Everybody was sleepwalking like some George Romero Night of the Living Dead film. I was this shiny, nice, smooth, clean lieutenant coming supposedly to take care of them. And all they had in their mind was, is this doofus going to get us killed or not? And that was the central mission of my unit. It wasn't to stop communism. It was to keep this microcosm of America alive in this alien environment.
The anti-war movement gained a new degree of credibility when returning veterans brought their dissatisfaction with the war back home.
Each day, someone has to die so that President Nixon won't be, and these are his words, the first president to lose a war. How do you ask a man to be the last man to die for a mistake?
The publication in June of 1971 of the top-secret Pentagon Papers confirmed the suspicion of many Americans that they had been misled by their government. Polls showed that 60% of the public believed the war to be a mistake. Finally, in January of 1973, the Nixon administration signed a peace treaty with North Vietnam and began the withdrawal of U.S. troops.
Whether they actually thought that South Vietnam could survive or whether it was sort of vain hope is still not totally clear, but obviously it did not survive, and the end comes in April '75.
On April 30th, 1975, as the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong soldiers entered Saigon, the last remaining Americans abandoned the United States Embassy in a dramatic rooftop evacuation.
Vietnam was a nightmare war. The deepest childhood fears come true. The friendly peasants of the day became menacing and lethal after dark, as if our own subconscious were rising up against us in our sleep. The protection of our modern selves was stripped away. Our technology, our air superiority, our firepower, all were useless. The very earth itself became the enemy. We fought a darkness we could neither penetrate nor understand.
Vietnam was America's longest war. Nearly 3 million Americans served, of whom 58,000 died or went missing. The war cost more than $140 billion, but failed to achieve its objective of preserving an independent, non-communist state in South Vietnam.
Part of the legacy of Vietnam is what the American government, in its various administrations, learned from it. One thing, limit press access. Second thing that the government learned was body counts upset people. No body counts. The third thing that happened during the war, and has remained, was end the draft. Nixon saw that. The last thing you want is a whole lot of mothers and fathers screaming and jumping up and down about their kids getting drafted. No draft.
What lesson we draw depends on who we are, where we're coming from politically or whatever. One lesson, more from the center or the political left, is you don't send troops into messy situations in third world countries. The other lesson from the right is the Powell Doctrine, that you don't go to war unless you have adequate troops, unless the aim is clear, unless you have strong public support. I think the important thing is knowing more about the history of countries we go into before we go in, not learn the hard way. We had great power in the 1960s. We have much greater power even now, but it's still very difficult to carry out what seem like relatively simple tasks in different parts of the world.
In time, the insights and the knowledge that had been gained and were expressed in the immediate aftermath of the war are attenuated. They're thinned out, but Vietnam remains. It's the war that has to be redeemed one way or another.
I went back in Vietnam in 1984 because those pieces of shrapnel, or whatever they were to me, that figuratively, had worked to the surface, and I just wanted to see the people I fought against. The line that is so full of fear and danger and mystery. It's us, them. And I wanted to go see who them was, and that was my biggest fear, was, was I going to be safe? Was I going to be reviled as this horrible American who'd ripped up their country? And quite the opposite. They didn't like our bombs, all that, but they loved the idea of our country compared to the idea of the Soviet Union. And I kept thinking, well, if we just dropped blue jeans and tape recorders on them instead of, napalm, things might have turned out a lot better. We have taken into our country hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. And you see how they've revitalized damaged central areas of cities and brought this incredible culture into the American life stream. There's this odd kind of legacy of getting this Asian peasant culture and this very entrepreneurial, family-centered culture into America has enriched us tremendously. We talk about unintended consequences as usually being bad. This is an unintended consequence which I think has been remarkably good.